Cool. So I'll just give a quick introduction. Today we have Winslow Hansen here from the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies in the Hudson Valley, not too far from us. He's going to talk about you can see climate and disturbance impacts on forests, scaling from seedlings to continents. Before starting his position at the Cary Institute, he was an EI postdoc fellow at Columbia, so kind of familiar with this area, but he just told me that he never visited GISS. So it's nice that we get a visit from him. Before that, he did his PhD at the University of Wisconsin medicine and graduated with a dissertation titled Changing Climate and Fire Implications for Post-Fire Forest Regeneration in High Elevation and High Altitude Conifer Forests, which is sort of my connection to why I invited Winslow to come and give a talk. He's kind of in between the fire and the ecology world. So there are a bunch of people here interested in his work. So with that, please.
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation and thanks for being here. It's really fun to get to GISS after so long and see the facility and meet you all. So I moved up to Cary Institute 3.5 years ago from Manhattan, and I've really enjoyed settling into the Hudson Valley, but all of my research is in the Western United States and Western Canada. So I very much from a research perspective think about Western forest dynamics and less about the East. I have, I don't know, maybe 35 minutes worth of material when I'm presenting, practicing, so feel free to interrupt with questions and comments, et cetera, and if I can't answer them, I'll point you to where you might find the answers. My research is very collaborative, and so what I'm presenting here today is projects that I've led, projects that others are leading that I'm contributing to, et cetera. It's kind of a wide range of different stuff. So as a Western fire ecologist, it's been hard on the East Coast for a long time to really get people to understand what we mean when we say North America is in a large fire era. Until last summer, when the fires in Canada, the record 2023 fire season, just kind of took everybody by shock. This is cumulative burned area last year through September 8th. And you can see 2023 highlighted there in purple, something like 41 million acres burned up to that point. And then you can see the previous 10 years cumulative burned area below that. I think something like 12 times more area burned than the 10-year average in Canada during the 2023 fire season. And for us here in New York City, this meant we experienced mainly the smoke. So our skies turned this apocalyptic orange color that we more often see in our West Coast cities. We were wearing masks again, kind of like a flashback to COVID.
Total flashback.
Total flashback, right. Baseball games were canceled, it was crazy, right? And the CDC actually jumped on this, as they do, and quantified some of the social impacts. And just to illustrate, on the worst air quality day in New York State, there was an 82% increase in asthma-associated ER visits in New York State. A really large impact. Today, I'm going to focus on the Western United States as a test case of where we might be able to gain insights about how fire regimes are changing, how forests are responding, and what we might do about it, to see if there's like lessons we can learn from this place that can help us more broadly live sustainably with fire during this era of profound change. And I think there's a couple reasons why the Western US is a good test case for this. First, it's one of the most data-rich places in the world. We have a tremendous amount of information about our forests and fire regimes and climate and people and all of the different dimensions that you could think about. And also, as we'll see in a little bit, the magnitude of change in terms of fire regimes and forest dynamics is pretty profound. But I start every talk with trying to remind people, no matter who it is, that while we're going to be talking about really big changes in fire regimes, we also have to remember that Western US forests have burned for hundreds of thousands of years. These are fire-adapted forests. Many of them need fire. So here we're looking at this kind of cool video we took last summer of a big stand replacing fire west of the Cascade Crest in Washington, just north of Seattle. Burned a huge amount of area, and you can see most of the mature trees are killed, right? This was stand replacing high severity fire. But it's also totally in line with the historical range of variability for this place. These tree species are adapted to this type of fire. And from the air here, maybe it looks like, kind of a moonscape, but if you were able to walk around and look closely, you'd see that that forest floor is actually littered with tree seedlings of the same species that were there in the overstory. So those seedlings are benefiting from that light that's happening with the overstory being consumed. There's a flush of nutrients and water. And those seedlings are likely to establish and grow up to a forest that's structurally and functionally very similar to what was there before the fire. We also know, though, from work that Park Williams did while he was here, a close collaborator of mine, that you'll see a lot of his in our research throughout this talk, that we've also seen big increases in the area burned in forests in the West. So this is the annual area burned on the y-axis for the observational period, essentially when Landsat came online from 1984 through 2022. And we've shown that there's roughly a 1,300% increase in annual forest area burned during this time period. I want you to track 2020, which is our current record year, and we're going to use that as kind of like a point of observation as we look at results throughout the rest of this talk. One of the reasons why we're seeing big increases in fire, probably a dominant reason, is that we know fire is really sensitive to climate, and specifically drought. So here we're looking at one calculation of vapor pressure deficit on the x-axis and the area burned again on the y-axis for those same years from 1984 to 2022. And there's 2 points to take away from this. So the first is that because the early period is colored blue and the later period is colored red, you can see this distinct shift towards warmer, drier summers, years actually, and then a lot more area burned. And then the second point to take away is that that relationship between vapor pressure deficit and area burned is super nonlinear, right? So one unit increase in VPD leads to an accelerating increase in burned area. You can see 2020 and 2021 there, just pretty huge years and compared to everything else we've seen. And then we also know the Western US is only going to continue warming and drying through this century, right? So this is showing from 1900 through 2100 in the Western United States, spring to fall vapor pressure deficit with observed in black, and then 2 emission scenarios in red and blue. Each of those are 34 GCMs with 1 simulation per model. And so the solid cut lines are showing the multi-model mean. The envelopes are showing the spread. And we're currently somewhere like right around in here, right? And look at that future that we're going to face over the next couple decades. So, climate is obviously a dominant driver, but we also know that it's not the only player in town when it comes to what drives fire. You also have to have fuels, because forest and fire are these dynamically coupled systems that interact and affect one another. So imagine in some hypothetical model world, we could set the vapor pressure deficit the same in the forests of the Sierra and the Mojave. We're obviously going to have more likelihood of fire in the forests of the Sierra because there's actually fuels there to burn, right? You need something to combust. These are extreme ends of the spectrum in terms of fuels, but we also know that even within an ecosystem like the forests of the Sierra, there's spatial and temporal variability in fuel amounts and connectivity that have important implications for fire. And one of the prime examples of that is over the last 150 years, we have been pretty much universally suppressing fire, and just until, a decade and a half ago. This was actually going out and putting out fires and then also extirpating indigenous cultural burning that was very widespread in locations out west. And what this did, particularly in the dry forest, so large areas of the West, not all the forests of the West, but large areas of the West, is it led to this fuel densification, right? We got more biomass accumulating, more connectivity of those fuels. And this is a nice example here where we have these time-lapse photos of Yosemite Valley in 1899 versus 2011. You can just see that densification between those two time periods. And then the final piece to keep in mind is there's a bunch of people out west, right? And they do really complicated things to fire. So anybody that's driven around the West over the last few years can realize that we've had really rapid expansion of the wildland-urban interface where people are living abutted or interacting with wild vegetation where fire risk is high. Some of our collaborators have documented that we've seen something between like 9.9 million housing units in the Wheelie in the West, and that's gone up to about 16.1 million in 2020. And people do really complicated things. So on the one hand, they account for the most of the ignitions that occur out west. But then on the other hand, fires are also more actively suppressed closer to wildland-urban interface, keeping those fires small. So it's a little hard to untangle the impacts. Now, I often find myself pretty depressed as a fire ecologist thinking about the future of Western forests. But in the last few years, I really think there are reasons for optimism that we should highlight. So I never would have predicted it even 5 years ago, but the amount of state, federal, and private investment that's going into this solution space of trying to figure out how to live more sustainably with fire is pretty shocking. And two examples of that are the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that Congress recently passed. I mean, Congress doesn't pass anything, right? But they got these bills through and they allocated $24 billion to wildfire preparedness, of which $10 billion was allocated to forest management, fuels management treatments, prescribed fire, mechanical thinning, to help reduce those fuels that are the legacy of suppressing fires for 150 years. And the other thing that's really amazing is there's this rapid and growing acceptance of the role of beneficial fire amongst the public. So a funding agency that I work with really closely did a poll of voters in the West, and they found overwhelming support amongst those voters of the need for beneficial fire in our Western ecosystems and the importance of prescribed burning. Everybody was pretty surprised.
Was that a change in attitude or just more awareness? Like, did they not even think about it before, or were they opposed to it before and then did a 180? But did they get a sense of that?
It's a good question. They didn't assess that. They did show that there is widespread awareness of it as an important issue, but they didn't assess whether that has changed over time in a way that would explain the change in growing benefit.
The Trump cited the Finland model as good management. So my question is that, is there element of truth in Trump's statement that this fire is largely because mismanagement in the United States?
It's a good question. And so I'll avoid the comparison to Finland and just tackle the mismanagement question. It's all of the above, right? Like climate change is a huge driver and fire activity would be increasing no matter what we had done in the past. But in these dry forests, so think about ponderosa pine in Arizona or low elevation forests in the eastern Sierras, those places, mismanagement has absolutely led to accumulation of biomass. That's undeniable. And that accumulation leads to much higher severity fires than would have been burning there pre-Euro-American settlement. So it's those two things together that then really lead to these catastrophic fires. But places like subalpine forests of Yellowstone, for example, where suppression was always a lot less. And because of the historical conditions and the types of fire regimes, that suppression has not had nearly the impact that it's had in those dry forests.
Is Finland model applicable to Yellowstone forest?
I think it's really hard to compare because Finland's forests have been so managed for timber for so long, and they have so much control because it's a smaller country, highly industrialized. I think it's really difficult to make that comparison. They have their own issues, let me tell you, of low biodiversity, insect outbreaks going crazy that are a result of their particular flavor of management.
Mixed.
Yeah, it's a mixture. It's complicated.
But that includes some money for rakes in that if it like gains bipartisan support.
Right.
Like,
Absolutely. So, there's reasons for optimism, but I have to make sure I still have a job. And so it's my responsibility to try to highlight that there remains important scientific uncertainty that we have to address, right? And I think some of the places where there is real uncertainty still is that we don't have a clear picture yet of what are the processes and drivers of the things that are going to underpin how forests respond to changing climate and disturbance. This is a really nice conceptual figure that my PhD advisor put together that shows the plausible space in which forests might reorganize in response to increasing disturbance. So you might see changes in tree species composition to new types of trees. You might see structural changes, so changes in the density of the forest, the biomass, the basal areas of the forest, the heights of the forest. And you might even see complete regime shift to non-forest ecosystem types. This is actually more widespread than I think a lot of people realize. So a recent paper that made a big splash did this pretty complex analysis that I won't get into, but essentially the takeaway was that if forests in the Sierra were to burn today, 20% of them would not come back as forests, which to me is just mind-blowing to think about. We also have a lot of uncertainty in how those proactive forest management strategies are actually going to scale. So prescribed burning, mechanical thinning. We've known for a long time that when a fire hits a recent treatment, we see reductions in intensity and severity. It's easier for fire personnel to get around in those locations. It's a lot safer, but we really don't know how that scales from the stand to the landscape, to the region, to the continent. So how much area do we need to treat? Where should we prioritize treatments? How often do they need to be retreated? Those are really important questions. And then we still have a lot of uncertainty because forests and fire regimes are tough to predict, especially over long horizons, what the most likely outcomes are going to be for us and our children. So in our research that we're about to jump into, we're going to try to address two questions. The first is we're going to talk through some active research where we're trying to understand how Western US forests and fire regimes might change over the next century and what to do about it. This is another drone image of a fire in eastern Washington. So it's just 50 miles from the first one I showed, but across the Cascade Crest into the rain shadow. This burned a decade ago, stand replacing fire again. And if we walked through this today, you would see not a single tree seedling. Nothing has regenerated at all. And you can notice there's plenty of seed source right on the edge, right? But it's too hot and dry to support tree establishment now. And then because we care about people and forests are really important for supporting life out west, we also want to think about what are the consequences for the ecosystem services that people depend on. Carbon storage, biodiversity, water is a big deal. But our research story starts right here, which is really fun. Just across the river at Lamont Doherty. It's like 2018, and I just started a postdoc with Park in the tree ring lab. Got to know Ed, met Ben on that. I think it was like within the first week he was over there. And we did this kind of fun thing. So instead of doing weekly meetings where we'd sit in Park's office and talk about research directions, we'd go for runs around Lamont together and talk science. And it was in this parking lot after a run where we kind of hit on the seed of the ideas that we've been pursuing ever since. So we were both really interested in understanding how forests were going to change, how fire was going to change at really broad scales, but with fine enough spatial resolution that we could inform decision-making and management at that like landscape level. And we both realized that none of the tools that existed at those scales really allowed you to think about those feedbacks. So we looked around for a bunch of stuff, we talked to a bunch of people, and then naively we decided we needed to build our own tool. And I don't think either of us realized what an effort that would be. But fast forward 6 years, and we've put together this modeling platform that we call Dynaforce, the Dynamic Temperate and Boreal fire and forest ecosystem simulator. So this is a statistical fire model that operates at a 12-kilometer grid resolution, paired with a forest process model where we really tried to focus on the processes through which we think forests are affected by fire and climate change, and then built a little more deterministically other processes around that, trying to make this scalable computationally. So this is a diagram of how the model actually plays out. In the past year, so in every grid cell, we estimate cohort mortality from the past year as a function of background causes, drought, fire. And then in grid cells where forests have been killed at some point, we estimate the probability of tree regeneration as a function of seed production and dispersal from the target grid cells and surrounding grid cells. Then we estimate the effects of climate on tree regeneration and establishment. For grid cells where tree seedlings establish and where we have forests, we grow those trees deterministically using allometric equations, and then estimate stand structure based on the dimensions of those trees and functional types, which allows us to estimate above ground biomass, turnover, to dead pools. Then we pass that forest information to the fire model. And the fire model is actually 3 individual models. The first is estimating the probability of at least one fire occurring in any given grid cell in any given month. Then, if compared to a random number generator, we determine at least one fire has occurred. We separately estimate the number of fires that occurred in that grid cell, and then their maximum sizes. And what's cool about this is we also break down each of those models into components of the spatial drivers of fire, the seasonal drivers of fire, and then the interannual drivers of fire. So all of those different factors are interacting to shape outcomes. Variables that are included include a suite of climate stuff, the forest model stuff that I pass on, and then some human land use variables. For every fire the fire module says occurred, we then pick a location and grow realistic fire perimeters, and then use information on climate and fuel moisture and tree dimensions and characteristics to estimate percent crown kill, combustion, and probability of mortality. So the whole model plays out annually, and then the fire model currently operates on a monthly scale. And when we started this, we thought, like it's all pretty complicated, but the forest part seemed the most complex, and because you're dealing with living organisms and the highest risk. So we thought we'd benchmark and test that module first before really investing in the fire model. And so we did simulations of the entire Western United States, and then broke it into 5 large regions that really vary in terms of forest types, climate, fire regimes, ranging from the super wet productive PNW to the super dry Southern Rockies. We simulated forests as 12 plant functional types. And then we threw the model results at forest inventory and analysis data to benchmark it, like all the variables we could possibly think about how to compare. The FIA data set's really cool. For those of you who don't know about it, it's like 160,000 plots that the Forest Service samples every 5 to 10 years to track the health of forests. And there's some complicating things about it. For instance, they don't want to hand out the actual plot locations to just anybody. And so there's this fuzz and swap procedure that shifts a certain percentage of the plots around. So you have to think pretty carefully about how to leverage that data set. But there are ways to get around it that make it still quite useful. So I'm just going to show one example to illustrate the types of benchmarking we did. So this is showing live and dead biomass pools and models and observations for those 5 regions, and just doing comparisons of the distributions in terms of their central tendency and their spread. So you can see for most of the regions, there's reasonable alignment in terms of the central tendency, but the model results are narrower compared to observations, which is not surprising to me, given that we're not representing all the mayhem in the forest that causes variation in biomass pools.
Sorry, are those histograms of each quantity?
So
Could
these
you
are
walk through one of the plots?
These are showing the distributions of values for the observations and modeled grid cells for these 5 regions. And the x-axis is stem and branch biomass, coarse wood biomass, litter, leaf in kilograms per hectare.
Okay.
And it's on a log scale. We have a paper published that shows these results and many others that I'd refer you to look at the other dimensions of benchmarking.
Oh, sorry,
So-
what is GYE again? What's GYE?
The Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. So that's Wyoming and southern Montana and Idaho with Yellowstone National Park at the core. So then we switched to the fire model, and that's what Park has been leading and I've been helping with over the last few years to really try to build out that model and then to benchmark it very carefully. So here what we're looking at on the x-axis or on the left side of the screen is fire probability for every month in our time series and then potential fire size. And then on the right, you can see an ensemble of simulations in terms of the number of fires for that same time period and the size of those fires. And remember, we include spatial variables, seasonal variables, and interannual variables into this model. And so what's really cool, you can look at the time series within a year. So let's say we're looking at fire probability. And you can see in many springs, we see Arizona and New Mexico fire probability light up. By July and August, the Northern Rockies and the Pacific Northwest are lighting up. And then even in some falls, that Southern California area lights up, which we were all very pleased with. And then you can also see interannual variability in terms of fire probability. So we've been benchmarking this at the West-wide and at regional levels to look at how the model performs. Here we're looking at 400 simulation ensemble members doing a cross-fold validation. You get a reasonably high R-squared. The brown is observation, so that's what satellite records say actually burned. So we were pretty pleased with this. And that paper is being written now and should be in review pretty soon. So of course, you know, the second we got a model that we felt was somewhat reasonable, we couldn't help ourselves but force it into the future to see what happened. So these are all super preliminary results. Keep that in mind. Hot off the press. This is a set of simulations from 1951 to 2100 that was forced with one GCM in a middle of the roads emissions scenario. And this is running the model in coupled mode. So what's really cool is once you have a coupled model, you can decouple or couple it and run counterfactual scenarios to see what is the impact of that coupling versus letting climate just rip. And we'll walk through that a little bit here. So these are the results in coupled mode. And remember our record 2020 year. So what we're seeing is by the middle of the 21st century, that record year becomes the annual average. And the ensemble mean shows at least 1 year where we have 10% of Western US forest area burning in a single year. So just massive increases in burned area. We then ran the model again where we held fuel static at 2023 levels so that fuel limitations couldn't magnify and just let the model go in response to climate. And so the difference between the red and the black is attributable to that fuel limitation. And so we found, you know, a little disappointingly, I think, pretty modest fuel limitations when we do these projections in the future in terms of area burn.
Sorry, could you step through that, the counterfactual without fuel feedback? So
Yeah.
that's, I'm sorry, could you just?
No worries. So the first run, the fire and the forest could affect each other.
Yeah.
So fire was combusting fuels and reducing forest dynamics, like reducing forest cover, et cetera, et cetera.
Maybe not growing back into the same.
Right. And then in the counterfactual, we just held the forest variables, the fuels, the connectivity, the structure of the forest at the 2023 level, and then assumed that that was the same each year.
Okay,
And so essentially climate is driving
and you see
the fire.
more fire when you prescribe the same forest.
That's right, because those fuel limitations are not increasing over time.
I have a
Everybody,
question online. Can you hear me? This is Nancy Kian. So when you say coupled, so it's the fuel and the meteorological drivers that are interacting, and the fuel change is at the monthly time step. Is that correct?
So the fuel changes annually
Yeah. Annually, okay.
and the fires are modeled monthly. So at the beginning of each year, we
Okay.
do the fuels and
Okay.
then we do the fire. Mhm.
Okay. All right. And is there anything else? So that means the cover is also changing, correct?
That's right. So,
Albedo also is changing. All the biophysics is what biophysics are coupled. It's
right. So
um,
that's a really important point, especially
mhm,
for this group, is
mhm.
that we do not have vegetation feedbacks back to climate in any way, right? So we're taking a climate model and assuming that that's the climate and that's driving forest and fire. I think we
Okay.
have
So
ambitions of eventually trying to couple with something like WRF, but
mhm.
that's years out, I would imagine.
Okay. So in like August, you still have the same fuels as July, and then but
Correct.
next year they get updated. Okay. So it's, all right.
Yep,
Thanks.
that's right.
And it's good enough. Okay. Maybe it's good enough. Okay.
Does that change for lighter seasonally over the course of the season for lighter fuels like Southwest shrub grassy stuff? And can that grass like die?
Great questions. So this is a forest model.
Okay.
So we're
gotcha,
only
gotcha,
simulating
Gotcha.
really core forest.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yep. We would love to expand into grasslands and shrublands, but we need to raise money to do that. Yeah.
Is that a high value caused by El Nino or caused by anything else?
Good question. I don't know. We haven't investigated that yet. Yeah, so like I said, these are hot off the press. Just a first stab at doing a prediction.
What is period? Large vacillation.
It looks like just before 2050.
I mean, it's period.
Return.
Cycles. Cyclically.
Oh,
What is period?
yeah, I'm not sure. That's a,
Could I ask another question, or should we wait till the end? Hi. So for in the firemint models, one of the hardest things for them to do was models in general is to predict seasonality of the fuels. So your fuels, you have your growth time step is also monthly time step, or what for the regrowth of the forest
no, for
and the
all of the
leaf area?
forest stuff
Okay.
is, all of the forest
Uh-huh.
is annual.
And annual. Okay, so you don't have a seasonal variation in biomass then.
Correct.
Okay, okay. And so how sensitive is your regrowth and annual regrowth to your allometry specification? I mean uncertainty.
So currently what we're doing is growing forest deterministically. So
Okay.
climate affects the probability of establishment of a cohort.
Mhm,
And then
mhm,
if a cohort establishes, we're currently growing them just based on height allometric equations. And
mhm.
climate does not affect that. We, in the next
All right.
stages, hoping to build in height and growth sensitivity to climate, but that's not currently
Mhm.
something that we have.
Okay, but the allometry itself is I don't know how you know how much it changes regionally for the
Yeah,
PFT. So that okay, say that could factor in, but still it looks pretty good predictability.
yeah, absolutely.
So
It's a really
okay.
important question, and obviously those allometries are going to vary tremendously across regions, even as a function of climate. And so there is a pretty big simplification there that we chose to accept, trying to make the model computationally tractable. I will say, these allometric equations are pretty well documented for the Western United States. Again, like benefiting from that data-rich region because the Forest Service has been trying to grow trees in silica for a long time to inform timber. So in the very least, there's been a lot of research that's gone into the allometric equations that are being used.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about this?
Can this high value prediction can be exploited economically or environmentally?
Explored?
Exploited.
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
So
Do you mean the cost?
you have this prediction, right? Can we take advantage of this prediction to benefit our economy or environment That is my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's hopefully the goal, right? Is that if we have better constrained projections, that can inform management decisions, economic decisions. I think there's also important implications for how we manage water, to prepare for these and to hope to avoid these projections, right? And I can get into that a little bit in the next couple.
Okay, maybe.
Sure.
Easy.
So in the interest of time, I think I'm gonna skip that and jump to this. So what can we do about it? How can we manage Western forests to avoid these catastrophically large fires, to try to reduce severity, to avoid forest loss and regime shift? One of our colleagues has used the model to kind of explore the space in interesting ways, and it's a nice test case for some of the things we're hoping to do at west-wide scales with the model in the future. So they took the Sierras region and ran dinoforests there under a bunch of different management scenarios. And this is a little complicated, so I'm gonna walk you through it quickly here. They did a control simulation where they ran it for 100 years. And then they did a bunch of different management scenarios, starting with a base of doing essentially mechanical thinning in model world of about 1,000 kilometers per year in places that had relatively high biomass loading, that were close to a road, that were not on steep slopes, and that were on public lands. And then they started messing around with a couple different dimensions of how managers might approach this. So the first was agency. And in the agency high scenario, managers could treat anywhere on public and private lands. It didn't matter. In the agency low scenario, they could only treat on federal lands. Then they messed around with access, where it didn't matter how far it was from a road or how steep the slopes were, managers could treat those forests, versus low, where it had to be very close to a road and very shallow slopes. And then finally, an axis of knowledge. So how much did the managers know about where the most dead biomass was? Did they have perfect knowledge? Did they have less than perfect knowledge? I ran those simulations for 100 years, and then looked at how things like severity and combustion differed between the control and the treatments. So here on the y-axis, we're looking at the area that burned in stand replacing events. So these were grid cells that experienced high severity fire where the cohort was killed. And the 0 line is our control of no treatments at all. And then the colored lines show the difference in stand replacing events between the treatments and that control. So the dot represents the time at which that particular treatment separated statistically from the control. So for instance, the treatment that had the highest efficacy was the synergy high, where we actually could do all the treatments together. And then the access high, or excuse me, the knowledge high, where we really knew exactly where the biomass was.
What's the shading?
The shading shows the envelope for the ensemble of simulations. And then they also looked at variables like how much carbon is lost from this ecosystem in those different treatments relative to the control, and found that, actually at that landscape scale, that amount of treatment had quite modest reductions in the amount of biomass that was lost. So, carbon is one of these critical factors when we think about the suite of ecosystem services, and it's one that's most directly affected by fire because we're literally combusting biomass, right? And I struggle a lot with this space of natural climate solutions. So on the one hand, we know that, the IPCC has made it pretty clear that most of the pathways, I think all the pathways that have less than 2 degrees of warming include some natural climate solution, right? And of course, forests are a dominant player in that field because that's what trees do, they sequester carbon. But there's also been so much greenwashing and so many problems in the forest sector in terms of carbon offset credit. Additionality is really hard, leakage is harder, that it's hard to see a path forward. But one of the things that's been really clear is we really need good baselines, right? So at least we have a baseline of what we have today to then be able to compare to in the future. And so one of the projects I've been working on for the last few years, actually with Charlie Canham at Cary, was funded by the Environmental Defense Fund to try to set as rigorous a scientific baseline for forest carbon as we could, to then compare model output to and future measurements to. And Charlie led the Eastern US analysis, and my postdoc and I did the Western US analysis. And then we collaborated on it. So this work was led by Jaslyn Hall, who's a postdoc in my group. She graduated from E3B here, did her PhD with Maria Uriarte. And she did an amazing job addressing these three questions. So the first is, what is the spatial distribution of forest carbon in the Western US? And then what are the climate and disturbance, human and topographic factors that shape that distribution? And finally, how has forest carbon changed between 2005 and 2019? We used the FIA database again to answer these questions, which is why we only went through 2019, because that's the last time that they updated it publicly. So I'm sure nobody is surprised by these results whatsoever, that there's more carbon in Pacific Northwest ecoregions than there are in Southwest ecoregions. But it gets a lot more interesting when we start to look at what are the drivers that underpin that. So she did this really cool analysis, which I'm just trying to wrap my head around as a statistical baby, where she used machine learning to actually map out at the grid cell level, what was the relative importance of different groups of drivers on carbon density in those ecoregions. So this is the results from a random forest analysis with many different drivers going in, and then used SHAP values to actually make predictions of what was the relative importance of these drivers. And what I love about this map, so we're looking at live carbon on the forest carbon on the right side and dead carbon on the left side. What I love about this map is it shows really clear regional patterns, right? So the PNW is dominated by human factors. This is the legacy of timber extraction. The Northern Rockies are dominated by fire. No surprise to anybody who spent time there. And then climate, specifically drought, is the major driver of the Southwest. But then when you zoom into any of these ecoregions, you can see there's still tremendous spatial heterogeneity in the drivers that underpin carbon distributions in ways that I think are really useful, kind of like landscape or Forest Service region scales to help make decisions about trying to manage carbon, trying to mitigate catastrophic losses from fire, perhaps even trying to increase carbon sequestration. And then she also looked at the trends at the ecoregion level. So how is carbon changing from 2005 to 2019? You know, we're starting to see losses in live carbon in places that you would expect. So the Northern Rockies, where fire's been really big. Southwest, where they just came out of a massive mega drought. And we are still seeing increases in carbon over time in the PNW. Again, a legacy of that industrial timber kind of ending and forest recovering from that. But what's important to remember is this is only through 2019, and 2020 and 2021 were both record fire years in the PNW. And so my postdoc and I are just like constantly clicking on the FIA database to see when they release the Western data, because I'm really interested to see how those trends shift, whether those thresholds have been crossed. Okay, so where do we go from here? A couple years ago, the National Science Foundation organized this really great workshop, maybe the best Zoom workshop I've ever been in, where they brought together fire ecologists and other fire scientists together to think through what is the research questions that we need to be thinking about for a program about fire into the Anthropocene. There hasn't been a ton of follow-up from NSF, which everybody's a little disappointed about, but it got the attention of a bunch of philanthropic groups, mainly the Moore Foundation. So this is Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and they actually got approved a special initiative on wildfire resilience. So they tasked us with putting together a research program called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative that brings together 10 teams from different institutions across the United States to try to advance the fields of fire ecology and forest resilience so that they're mature enough to support the really difficult decisions that policymakers and managers are going to have to make in coming decades. I'm not going to go through everybody here, but just a couple highlights that have Columbia connections. So, of course, Park, who spent a lot of time here during his early portion of of his career. Alex Koenig spent some time here, who's doing remote sensing of live fuel moisture. Miriam Marlier also graduated from E3B, I believe, and is doing smoke modeling and estimating human health impacts of that smoke.
Worked here too.
Worked here.
Yep.
Okay, there you go. And then a bunch of other really great people. And our collaborative has 5 objectives. So the first that we invested in from the very beginning is to try to build a community of practice with the decision makers who might use the information. The idea is to know what they're thinking, what they need, and then to have those relationships in place so that as we produce information, we can seamlessly feed it to them to make decisions. That effort, as I'll get into a little bit, then informs the next set of objectives that are more focused on the science. So really trying to understand the mechanisms that underpin that forest resilience and where we might lose forests, improving our ability to track forests and fire regimes, feeding that data into models to make projections, and then analyzing ecosystem service consequences. And just a few highlights from each of those objectives. So a year and a half ago, we started having conversations with decision makers across the West. These were interviews, focus groups, town hall meeting about what they saw as the big knowledge gaps that really constrain decision making. And then what were the barriers to using science? How can we communicate with them, et cetera. And this led us to kind of develop this framework for how you might approach doing actionable fire science.
What kind of decision makers?
It was a wide range of folks. So federal manager, Forest Service managers, USGS scientists, state government people, NGOs, TNC type people, kind of the broad spectrum of anybody we could get to talk to us. So we developed this framework for thinking about how you might approach effective and actionable fire science, starting from the beginning of the project with engagement of trying to understand who are the people that were already operating in the space and what were they doing to find good partners. Then rethinking how we communicate science through the research process. You know, often by the time a peer-reviewed paper comes out, it's stale to the science community, let alone the decision maker who had to make a decision 2 years ago on that topic. And then also, you know, being really like realistic and humble and patient with the role of science in decision making. So even the best science is just one stream feeding into a big river. How do you approach that in a way of humility and creativity and patience to try to have an impact, but also understand why decisions might go other ways? So from that effort, then we started thinking about these different science objectives. So we're really starting to flush out some field experiments and field observation that will help us understand better how forests might respond to fire. So just as one example, Laura Kippers is thinking through a CO2 fertilization experiment to understand how that might affect post-fire tree regeneration and how little seedlings can handle drought conditions. And that's meant to be paired with modeling and remote sensing, kind of a feedback cycle so that we can benefit from both approaches. We have a couple different people working on remote sensing of fire behavior and severity, pretty hand in glove, in really functional ways that we hope will help decision makers a little bit more than, you know, like, for instance, RDNBR, the metric of fire severity might. Now, I've been a fire scientist for a long time, and I have no idea what RDNBR really means. And so we're trying to think about ways to translate that information into variables that a forest manager is going to understand. Just one example of that, Jennifer Balch at CU Boulder took remote sensing data and was able to translate it into, at the pixel level, tracking what is beneficial fire versus detrimental fire. Essentially, beneficial fire is fire that burned at a severity that's in line with what the historical range of variability was. So this is fire that we would expect to be reducing fuels and helping us reduce the risk of catastrophic climate-driven fire in the future. And actually, it's actually a surprising amount of the fires that are burning today that are burning at totally reasonable severities that are reducing those fuels in beneficial ways and revitalizing ecosystems. And then we're building on that Dynaforest platform to really try to be able to make projections using a couple different models at the tree, the stand to landscape, and then to the west-wide scale, paired with that statistical fire model. And finally, quantifying the consequences for a bunch of ecosystem services. So we talked about carbon storage. We're going to use that baseline that Dr. Hall put together to then compare our model outputs to and to see how different management scenarios influence carbon storage. Miriam and her postdoc are working on being able to estimate smoke transport from our coupled dinoforest model, so we know where the smoke goes and who gets exposed to it. And then a couple other things, biodiversity, some water work, et cetera. So I think with that, take any questions, other questions that people have, lots of comments would be welcomed. And then just as a plug, for any of you who are either looking for postdocs or know people who are looking for postdocs, we are in desperate need of postdocs. And we have an advertisement out that actually is a multi-institution deal. So you could apply and end up at Stanford, UC Berkeley, or up to Cary with me. So hopefully I'm going to pass the word on. Thanks so much for your attention and being here.
I have a question.
Much news about fire in Tennessee, New York, Appalachian, but we always hear fire in California. What happened?
I know, it's a really good question, right? So, and I get this question about, in some flavor, about fires in the East every time. And actually, Robert and I have both been participating in this kind of like infant working group. We're just getting started, and there's been some fits and starts, but about Eastern fire and thinking through some of the research directions that might make a lot of sense for approaching Eastern fire. I think there's maybe a few reasons why we don't hear about fires in Tennessee and New York as much as out west. And one of the big ones, I think, is the fires are just so much larger for the most part out west. They really capture people's attention. You know, it's hard to get around San Francisco, pictures of San Francisco in that orange kind of haze.
Tennessee also have a very great park, right? What's the name?
Great Smoky Mountains.
Yeah.
So shouldn't have a lot of fire too, right?
They also had a big fire like 10 years ago.
They did, absolutely, and it took everybody by surprise. And the research is, you know, like, is showing that if you think of like a fire apron, it's slowly moving north on the east. So, you know, like Florida, the Southeast has always had a ton of fire, but the climate conditions conducive to fire are slowly moving north. And one of the things that I think is critical to remember is that small fires burn houses just fine, right? And we have such a high density of homes interspersed amongst forest and even towns interspersed amongst forest that like, I think the time to act and think about this is now, and try to learn what we can from managing fires out west to be a little more prepared out east, because it seems to be coming.
And with way less infrastructure and like awareness, unless you've gone through it, like the Tennessee situation, you know,
Also,
like.
the East also have a very different history of fire management. Like there's prescribed burns are much more easily improved and pretty, like they happen pretty often in the East, right?
Especially in the Southeast. So there's this interest, and it'd be fun to learn about the history of how this happened. But there was this bifurcation where out west, there was this universal suppression philosophy, and somewhat in the Northeast too, this universal suppression kind of approach. Whereas the Southeast went on this totally different trajectory of embracing fire from the very beginning, doing lots of prescribed burns, and they have this very advanced fire culture there as well. Now, what's kind of crazy is suppression, and maybe, you know, like it was an appropriate to say, but maybe we should blame it on Yale, right? The School of Forestry, so like at the foundation of the Forest Service, played a really important role. But what's fascinating is that suppression led to really different outcomes in the West versus the Northeast, right? So in the Western US, you get this buildup of fuels in dry forests, which we've been talking about for an hour. Here in the Northeast, what we saw was much more of what people call a mesification of our forests. So as we started to suppress fires, we actually saw changes in species composition. So like an expansion of wet deciduous forests versus the oak woodlands that were often here in many places. And those forests, because they are so mesic, actually reduced fire. So that caused this negative feedback that reduced fires even without self-suppressing them. And so then the question becomes like, how dry does it have to get those deciduous forests to life and burn? And it really depends on who you ask. And I don't think we have great data to support anybody.
So Nancy has a question online.
Hi, yes. One thing we're trying to understand, I guess, how to construct a baseline level of fire in the pre-industrial. It seems like with Dynaforest and some historical data, you have a great tool for trying to see what posing possible indigenous burning regimes and any plans for that. And also, is your Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, are you engaging the indigenous communities in cultural burning?
Both great questions. We are preparing paleoclimate data sets, and by we I mean Park, to force the model with that climate data.
Awesome.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what happens. One of the challenges with any statistical model is that it's still parameterized based on the period in which we have observations. And so I think there's a lot of uncertainty to whether those statistical relationships will continue to hold up. But we have terrible information, so any information that we could gain would be really useful. And then for engagement with indigenous communities, there are a number of pieces of the initiative, like the broader Moore Foundation initiative, that are supporting cultural burning. So they're working specifically with the Cary tribe in Northern California is one example.
Right. Yeah.
We have been struggling a little bit to think about how to do that engagement in ways that are beneficial to both groups. And what I mean by that is, just to provide a little history, when I started as a researcher, I actually started up in Alaska working with indigenous communities, trying to think through how climate change might affect their access to wild foods. And the one lesson I learned is that, like, if you're going to do that engagement, that is a career's worth of engagement to do it right.
Okay.
And the scale really matters, right? So working with one group takes a tremendous amount of energy and focus and relationship building. And how do you scale that? So if our domain is the entire Western United States, how do we work with many different indigenous communities at the level that's required? One thing we're working on is thinking about engaging with some indigenous organizations that bring multiple tribes together. So for example, there's a professional organization for indigenous foresters that we're considering working with. And what's really exciting is our deputy director of policy and management, who actually is trained in this and knows how to do engagement, started up 3 weeks ago and is starting to put together a more professional strategy than just a bunch of forest ecologists bumbling around in a space they don't really understand.
Thank you. Related to that, you said the Southeast embraced fire practice early on. Were they learning from previous indigenous practices? Can we see did they preserve the pre-industrial regime of vegetation, or was it totally different for just plantation forest?
That's also a good question that I don't know the answer to. There has been a lot of plantations that have been put in, and there has been change in forest composition, but the extent to which indigenous practices informed fire burning, prescribed burning is not clear to me. But a really interesting question to look into.
Sorry, I have one more question. Am I taking up other people's time? One more question. So you have all these specific tree PFTs. They were chosen probably because you had really good allometry data and they're critical timber species, maybe. And then maybe, can you elaborate on how you chose them, and have you tried simplifying? Because we have typical global vegetation models only have one evergreen needle leaf tree type and one broadleaf deciduous tree type. And if you were to simplify Dynaforest that way, what would your outcome be?
Also, great question. So we picked those 12 PFTs to try to represent the range of forest types that are out there. And for me, this is a simplification that was really hard
Yeah.
to like embrace, right?
Right.
So I come at this from a field background, and I come from this from an individual based landscape modeling perspective where we have every tree species parameterized. But we're only simulating, 60,000 hectare landscapes with a lot of detail. And so, no, we haven't tried to simplify more, and I would struggle with that.
Okay.
Um,
I have another question. I could wait till we meet though, if you want. So,
Yeah.
thanks.
Are there any other questions?
So there's no questions online. I have a quick question. It seems like Nancy kind of got at this with her question earlier. It seems like your model is more focused on climate driving fires rather than vice versa.
Yeah.
So I have a question about energy systems and the grid in the US. I think sometimes from our perspective, we think about how climate can impact those, like how fire can impact those. When you're looking at drivers, have you studied at all, like the grid driving fires, for example, Lahaina, and I think the fire that destroyed Paradise, some of those issues are related to like utility companies not shutting off power.
Yeah.
So have you guys tried to account for that? Or are you looking into that?
So yes, it's so hard. Not surprisingly, they don't want to share the maps of where the power lines are. So it's hard to get good data on where the power lines actually are. I know Park has put a lot of effort in finding that.
No kidding.
At that whole west-wide scale. But we do have a number of variables that serve as proxies, right? So like distance to wildland urban interface, distance to roads, campgrounds, which we can assume, to some extent also align with distance from power lines and infrastructure.
That's so interesting. That's not helpful.
Yeah, it's been really hard to find any information on that.
I know that a lot of those, or one of those power companies at least are, I mean, they're going bankrupt or getting sued.
Is there?
It's in there, so the parent like PG&E, I think. it's
Yeah.
Paradise, but they're aware of it, and I think there are some changes. I talked to a guy about a month ago. He's an investor, he's a banker, but invests in like municipal bonds and stuff. So went to tour one of these power companies who are, I don't know if they were at fault at one point, but they certainly know of the issues. And are like investing in like cameras, fire detection cameras, and like little weather stations to know if if it's dry under there. You don't hear about, so you hear about that stuff, and even like fuel thinning. You don't hear about the large scale investments in like burying power lines or I think some of the just basic maintenance
Yeah.
that's been neglected.
Yep.
Right, but they're certainly looking for some quick, cheaper fixes.
Yep.
To reduce their exposure. Okay, I have a question maybe building on that, like for your model, like the business as usual scenario. Like what can you say about the livability of the Western US in 50 years?
I mean, I live here.
Yeah,
We're thinking about buying land in northern Vermont.
yeah,
I think, it's depressing to say, despite the fact that I'm trying to convey some optimism. I think between the fire and the water, the West is going to be a very challenging place to live.
yeah.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it up there. It's sort of a few minutes over, but
Coming on a light note.
yeah, but you put some optimism in it. Okay, thank you so much. Can we just
Thank
give
you.
another round of applause? And we have your contact info. So,
Yes.
all right.
Come up anytime. We love having visitors.